Don't let her leave yet. A small voice cut through the shimmering silence of the Grand Roosevelt Gala like a blade through silk, and in that instant, everything froze. Champagne glasses paused mid-air, conversations collapsed into stunned whispers, and every head in the room turned toward a 7-year-old girl standing near the marble staircase. Her name was Ava Carter, her dress simple compared to the glittering gowns around her, her eyes steady in a way that didn't belong to her age, and across the room, billionaire Jonathan Blake slowly lowered his glass, his sharp gaze locking onto her as confusion tightened his expression, because the woman Ava was pointing at, Victoria Hale, stood only a few feet from the exit, calm, composed, already holding her designer clutch as if nothing in the world could possibly concern her. Victoria turned slightly, offering a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I think the child is mistaken," she said softly, her voice smooth like polished glass, and a ripple of uneasy laughter passed through a few guests who didn't know whether to believe a child or a woman who had spent years perfecting her presence in rooms like this. Jonathan exhaled slowly, the weight of interruption pressing against his patience. "Ava," he said firmly but controlled, stepping closer. "What are you talking about?" Ava didn't flinch. She simply pointed again, her small finger unwavering. "She can't leave yet," she repeated, quieter this time but sharper, as if the certainty inside her had already decided the outcome. Daniel Reed, Jonathan's assistant, leaned in slightly, scanning the room with a technician's instinct, his eyes narrowing as he followed Ava's line of sight toward Victoria's clutch. Something about the way Ava stood there didn't feel like panic. It felt like recognition, like she had seen something no one else had bothered to notice. Victoria let out a soft breath of amusement, tilting her head. "This is absurd," she murmured. "I'm afraid I don't know what she thinks she saw." But her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her bag, just for a second, just enough for someone paying attention to notice, and Ava noticed everything. Because Ava had stopped being a child in this moment, and had become something else entirely, a witness, a keeper of something hidden. Jonathan's gaze shifted between them, uncertainty flickering beneath his authority. He had built empires on reading people in seconds, on knowing when numbers lied and when they didn't. But children were not part of his calculations, and yet something in Ava's voice refused to register as noise. It registered as signal. Daniel cleared his throat. "Sir, the security feed from this wing is running through a secondary relay," he said quietly, tapping his tablet. "There may be a delay in live visibility." Victoria's smile tightened at the edges, just barely, and she took a subtle step toward the exit again. But Ava moved first, not blocking her, not touching her, just speaking louder this time. "If she leaves now, you won't see what she did." And that sentence shifted the air in the room, like a pressure drop before a storm. Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his attention sharpening as instinct finally overtook hesitation. "What did she do?" he asked, not loudly, but with the kind of calm that demanded truth instead of performance. Ava hesitated only a fraction of a second before answering. "She thought no one was watching," she said, "but she didn't know about the hidden camera." The words landed softly but changed everything. Daniel looked up immediately, fingers flying across his tablet. "Hidden camera," he repeated under his breath, not surprised, but recalculating. Victoria's expression flickered for the first time. Not fear exactly, but something close to irritation wrapped in caution. "This is ridiculous," she said again, but her voice had lost its effortless smoothness. Jonathan raised a hand slightly, signaling Daniel. "Pull it," he said simply, and the room seemed to contract as Daniel accessed the system. The screen near the private lounge flickered once, then twice, unstable, distorted, a soft digital static filling. The silence. Guests leaned forward unconsciously, drawn by the sudden shift from social elegance to technological tension. Ava didn't move. She just watched, her small hands clasped in front of her like she had already seen what was coming. Victoria tried one more step toward the exit, but security subtly repositioned, not aggressively, just enough to make movement impossible without acknowledgement. And then the screen stabilized for a brief moment, showing fragments, reflections, partial motion near a conference table earlier that evening. Jonathan's eyes locked onto the feed, his entire posture changing as recognition began to form. Something was there, something unaccounted for, something no one had mentioned in any briefing, Ava whispered softly, almost to herself. It's already running. And in that instant, the hidden camera feed fully engaged, and the room, once filled with wealth and celebration, fell into a silence so complete it felt like time itself had stopped breathing. The silence inside the Grand Roosevelt Gala did not break. It deepened, stretching across the marble floor like something alive, as every guest stared at the flickering screen where fragments of the hidden camera feed began to stabilize, showing the private conference area from earlier that evening, where polished voices and professional smiles had once filled the space, now replaced by grainy motion and distorted audio that no one could ignore. Jonathan Blake stood completely still, his eyes locked on the image as if trying to force it to make sense through sheer will, while Ava Carter remained beside him, small and unmoving, her gaze never leaving the screen as though she already knew every second that would appear next. Daniel Reed adjusted the settings on his tablet with rapid precision, his voice low but steady as he confirmed. This is a live recovery of archived footage from the internal relay system. It was masked under maintenance mode. And that single sentence shifted the room again, because maintenance mode meant restricted access, and restricted access meant intention. Victoria Hale turned slightly toward the screen, her composed expression tightening just enough to betray discomfort, though her voice remained controlled as she spoke. I have no idea what kind of system error this is, but this has nothing to do with me, she said, placing one hand gently near her chest as if offended by the implication itself, and a few guests shifted uneasily, wanting to believe her because belief was easier than disruption. Jonathan finally exhaled, his gaze narrowing as he studied the footage more closely, the billionaire instinct in him no longer passive but calculating, measuring inconsistencies, timing, angles, the kind of details that usually protected him from deception. But Ava's earlier words echoed in his mind, simple and unchanging. She didn't know about the hidden camera, and that certainty began to outweigh everything else. Daniel leaned closer to the screen. There is a timestamp mismatch between recorded audio and visual feed, he added. Someone attempted to synchronize and failed. Victoria's eyes flickered again, sharper this time, and she took a small step back toward the exit, only to find that the subtle repositioning of security had now fully closed any unnoticed escape path. Jonathan noticed it immediately, not as aggression, but as procedure, and that realization alone changed his posture, his shoulders straightening as authority replaced hesitation. Ava finally spoke again, her voice soft but precise. She thought the system was off, she said, but it was still watching. Victoria let out a quiet breath that sounded almost like disbelief, then forced a small smile. A child is interpreting technical data she does not understand, she said calmly, turning slightly toward Jonathan as if appealing to reason itself. Jonathan, surely you are not going to entertain this. But Jonathan did not respond immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the screen where the footage began to sharpen, revealing subtle movements around a document folder, hands adjusting papers, a brief exchange near the edge of the frame that suggested something far more deliberate than coincidence. Daniel paused, then said carefully, Sir, the file transfer logs show unauthorized access to internal contracts approximately 20 minutes before the gala began. The room shifted again, the weight of that statement pressing into every corner, because unauthorized access meant breach, and breach meant intent. Victoria's composure cracked just slightly at the edges, not enough for most to notice, but enough for Jonathan to see it clearly now, and Ava saw it too. Though she said nothing more, she did not need to, because the screen now showed enough, fragments aligning into continuity, enough to suggest that what had been hidden was not accidental, but structured, deliberate, and close, too close. Jonathan took a slow step forward, his eyes never leaving the footage as he asked quietly, Victoria, what exactly were you doing in that room earlier? And for the first time, Victoria did not answer immediately. The silence she offered was heavier than words, and in that silence, the truth inside the footage continued to unfold, piece by piece, under the cold glow of the screen that no one could turn away from anymore. The moment the footage stabilized fully on the screen, the entire Grand Roosevelt Gala seemed to lose its identity as a celebration and transform into something colder, more exposed, as if the polished walls themselves were now holding their breath. Jonathan Blake stood just a few feet from the projection, his eyes narrowing as the internal recording revealed a conference room earlier that evening, where Victoria Hale had been present under the pretense of a standard review meeting. The video showed her moving calmly between two executives, adjusting a folder on the table, then pausing for just a fraction of a second near a secured document case. Ava Carter did not move from her position, her small frame steady beside Jonathan, her attention fixed on the exact moment her instinct had warned her about. Daniel Reed leaned in closer to the tablet feed, syncing timestamps across multiple systems, and then spoke with a controlled urgency. "Sir, the system logs confirm that the document access occurred at exactly 6:34 p.m., but the authorized access window for that file was closed at 5:40 p.m. The implication settled into the room like a slow drop in temperature because it meant someone had entered a restricted file set after hours, and the system had recorded it. Victoria turned slightly, her expression still composed, but now visibly strained at the edges. "This is a misunderstanding of internal permissions," she said carefully, her voice remaining smooth but less certain. "I was invited to review materials as part of the pre-meeting briefing." Jonathan finally shifted his gaze from the screen to her, his tone quiet but sharp. "No one authorized post-lock access to those files," he said, and the difference in his words was subtle but absolute, because in his world, authorization was not a suggestion, it was structure. Ava took a small step forward then, not to confront, but to indicate, pointing softly at the screen where a faint reflection in the glass partition showed another figure briefly entering and leaving the frame. "She was not alone," Ava said, her voice calm, and that single observation redirected every eye in the room back to the footage. Daniel paused the playback, zooming in, enhancing clarity frame by frame, and what emerged was not chaos, but coordination. Victoria's movements aligned with another individual outside the main frame, suggesting information transfer rather than coincidence. Murmurs began to rise among the guests, not loud enough to break decorum, but enough to signal that perception had shifted. Jonathan raised a hand slightly, and the room quieted instantly, his attention now fully locked on the details, the billionaire mind no longer reacting emotionally, but reconstructing events with precision. "Enhance the peripheral capture," he instructed, and Daniel complied. The screen flickered again, resolving a secondary angle that showed Victoria near a secured terminal interface, her hand hovering just long enough to register a command input before stepping away. Victoria's voice sharpened slightly. "This is being interpreted out of context," she said, but for the first time there was no confidence behind it, only controlled resistance. Ava looked up at Jonathan briefly, then back at the screen. She thought no one would notice the delay between actions. Ava said softly, "But timing always leaves a trace." Jonathan did not respond immediately, because he had already seen it, the subtle lag between authentication and execution, the kind of detail that only appeared when someone tried to conceal intent behind procedure. Daniel then added, carefully, "Sir, there is also evidence of a secondary device connection routed through a personal channel during the same time frame." And that statement shifted everything again, because it meant the system had not only been accessed, but externally mirrored. Victoria took a step back without realizing it, her composure now visibly strained, as if the walls of the room had begun to close in through information rather than force. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Victoria, step away from the exit," and she froze for a brief moment before turning her head slightly toward the doors, realizing for the first time that her movement had been noticed in full context. Ava remained still, but her eyes never left the screen, where the final sequence of footage now showed a completed transfer confirmation. A simple on-screen notification that indicated a file had been successfully exported outside the secured network. The room did not react loudly. There were no dramatic sounds or sudden movements, only the quiet collapse of certainty, as Jonathan Blake slowly understood that what he had dismissed as interruption was in fact warning, and what he had assumed was confusion was actually timing that had already been completed before anyone chose to look. The atmosphere inside the Grand Roosevelt Gala had fully transformed now, no longer resembling a celebration but something closer to a suspended investigation, where every breath felt measured and every glance carried weight. Jonathan Blake stood between the glowing screen and Victoria Hale, his posture no longer uncertain but controlled, as if he had mentally shifted from guest to authority in a matter of seconds. Ava Carter remained just beside him, quiet but present in a way that seemed almost impossible to ignore, while Daniel Reed kept his focus on the system feed, carefully tracing the digital pathways that had revealed the unauthorized transfer. Victoria exhaled slowly, lifting her chin as she tried to reclaim composure. Jonathan, this is becoming a misunderstanding driven by incomplete technical interpretation, she said evenly, her voice carefully reconstructed into professionalism. But Jonathan did not respond immediately, his eyes still locked on the last frozen frame of the hidden footage, where confirmation of file export remained visible like an unerasable mark. After a brief pause, he finally spoke, his tone calm but absolute. "Nothing about this system logs is incomplete," he said, and the simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any raised voice could have, because in his world, systems did not misinterpret themselves. Daniel stepped slightly forward, adjusting his tablet again. "Sir, I have isolated the outbound connection trace," he said. "The transfer was routed through a mirrored authentication token linked to a secondary device that is not registered under corporate access profiles." That sentence shifted the energy again, because it removed ambiguity and replaced it with structure. Victoria's eyes flickered briefly toward Daniel, then back to Jonathan, her expression tightening. "You are all reacting to what appears to be a system anomaly," she said, carefully, but Ava quietly shook her head, not interrupting, just disagreeing without words. Jonathan finally turned fully toward Victoria, his gaze now direct. "Explain the device," he said simply, and the room felt the impact of that request more than any accusation, because it was not emotional, it was procedural. Victoria hesitated for the first time, just long enough for silence to fill the space between them, and in that silence Ava spoke again, her voice soft but steady. She thought the second connection would not be visible if the main system looked normal, she said, and though she was only a child, her words aligned too precisely with what Daniel was seeing on the tablet. Victoria turned slightly toward Ava now, her composure thinning at the edges. "This child should not be interpreting corporate security architecture," she said, a controlled edge entering her tone. But Jonathan raised one hand slightly, stopping that line of argument before it could expand. "Do not redirect," he said firmly, and that single instruction re-established control over the entire room. Daniel then displayed a secondary log stream on the main screen, showing a sequence of synchronized access points across multiple terminals, all converging within a narrow time window earlier that evening. "There is a pattern of coordinated entry behavior," Daniel said. "This is not isolated interaction, it is structured sequencing." Victoria took a slow step backward, then stopped as she realized security personnel were no longer passive observers, but quietly aligned with Jonathan's positioning, not aggressive, just attentive. Jonathan looked at the data again, absorbing it in silence, then finally spoke. "This was not a misunderstanding," he said. "This was preparation." The word landed heavily in the room, because preparation implied intent extended over time. Ava looked up at Jonathan briefly, then back at the screen, where the transfer confirmation still remained visible. She thought the timing would hide it. Ava said quietly, "But timing is the first thing systems remember." Victoria's expression tightened again, but now there was something else beneath it, not anger, but the recognition that every layer of explanation was collapsing under evidence that did not require interpretation. Jonathan took a slow step forward, closing the distance between himself and Victoria, not aggressively, but decisively. "Step away from the network terminal access point," he said, and Victoria paused, realizing the instruction was no longer conversational. Daniel then added carefully, "Sir, I recommend immediate isolation of all connected devices in this room pending audit," and without hesitation Jonathan nodded once. "Do it," he said, and Daniel began executing the command sequence, as the room watched the invisible infrastructure around them begin to lock down piece by piece. Victoria glanced toward the exit again, but the shift in security posture made the limitation clear without a single physical confrontation. Jonathan's voice lowered slightly as he continued. "If you are not involved in this transfer, Then you will cooperate fully with verification procedures. And that statement, structured and final, left no space for negotiation. Ava remained still, but her presence had changed the trajectory of everything, because what began as a child's warning had now become the central reference point for every decision in the room. And as the system audit sequence began running in real time across the screens, the truth was no longer something being searched for. It was something already unfolding in plain view. The system lockdown sequence completed with a quiet digital confirmation that echoed through the Grand Roosevelt Gala's internal network, and almost immediately the atmosphere shifted again, not into chaos, but into controlled movement, as if the building itself had accepted a new operational state. Guests who moments ago had been frozen in place were now gently redirected by staff toward adjacent lounge areas under the explanation of a temporary technical review, but the true center of gravity remained where Jonathan Blake, Ava Carter, Daniel Reed, and Victoria Hale stood beneath the dim glow of the projection screens. Jonathan's expression remained steady, but now carried the unmistakable focus of someone who had fully transitioned from observation to command. Daniel confirmed softly. All external network bridges have been isolated. Internal communication channels are now restricted to secure local nodes only. And that confirmation established a new boundary around the situation, one that could not be bypassed without deliberate authorization. Victoria stood a few steps away from the main console, her posture still composed but noticeably restrained, as if she was now measuring every movement against a system that no longer responded to her influence. Ava Carter remained near Jonathan, her small figure contrasting sharply with the scale of the environment around her. Yet her attention was fixed with unwavering clarity on the audit feed that continued to scroll across the central display. Jonathan turned slightly toward Daniel. "Begin full transaction reconstruction," he said calmly, and Daniel complied immediately. Pulling up a chronological map of all system interactions from the past 2 hours, the screen shifted into a layered interface showing access points, file interactions, and authentication chains, each one aligned with precise timestamps. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice more measured than before. "You are treating correlation as causation without confirming intent," she said, attempting to re-establish analytical distance. But Jonathan did not look at her immediately. Instead, he studied the reconstructed sequence unfolding on the screen. Ava, however, responded quietly without turning away from the display. "Intent always leaves structure," she said, and the simplicity of that statement caused a subtle silence to settle again. Daniel paused briefly, then highlighted a cluster of entries. "This section shows repeated access attempts under rotating authentication tokens," he explained. "The pattern suggests deliberate concealment of identity trails." Jonathan finally turned his full attention toward Victoria, his tone steady but now absolute. "You were inside this system at the exact moment these patterns were generated," he said, not as accusation, but as fact within a verified timeline. Victoria inhaled slowly, maintaining composure. "I was conducting a scheduled review of compliance documentation," she replied, "which is fully within my authorized scope." But Daniel immediately countered, "Compliance review does not require secure file export routing." And that distinction sharpened the room's tension again. Jonathan raised a hand slightly, stopping further verbal escalation, then spoke with controlled precision. "We are no longer discussing roles or permissions," he said. "We are reconstructing sequence integrity." Ava glanced up briefly at Jonathan, then back to the screen where a new visualization appeared, showing a clear divergence point where internal data was duplicated and rerouted outside the primary system. "That is the moment she thought it disappeared," Ava said softly, pointing at the divergence node, and Daniel zoomed in further, confirming that a mirrored process had been initiated milliseconds before the export confirmation appeared. Victoria took a slow step backward again, not toward escape, but toward distance, as if space itself could restore balance to the situation. Jonathan noticed and adjusted his stance slightly, ensuring that the operational perimeter remained intact without overt confrontation. The room itself had now transformed into a controlled analytical environment, with security personnel positioned discreetly at exits and system terminals locked into audit mode. Daniel continued, Secondary verification shows that the mirrored access originated from a device registered under an external identity profile linked through encrypted proxy routing, he said. And that information caused a ripple of quiet realization among those still observing from the edges of the gala. Jonathan's gaze hardened slightly, not emotionally, but structurally, as if every new piece of data was reinforcing a conclusion already forming beneath the surface. Victoria finally responded again, but her tone was no longer defensive. Instead, it carried controlled insistence. You are building a narrative around system behavior without acknowledging procedural overlap in enterprise environments, she said, but Jonathan interrupted gently. Procedure does not rewrite timestamps, he replied, and that single statement ended the argument framework. Entirely, Ava remained still, but her presence continued to anchor the entire sequence, as if her initial warning had evolved into the structural key that everything else now revolved around. Daniel initiated the final reconstruction layer, and the screen transitioned once more, revealing a clean sequence of events that showed data entry, duplication, and export confirmation aligned in perfect chronological order. Jonathan studied it in silence for several seconds before speaking again. "This is not an error," he said quietly. "This is execution." And as those words settled into the room, the distinction between confusion and intent disappeared completely, leaving only the unfolding reality of what had already been done. The final reconstruction sequence completed across the Grand Roosevelt Gala's internal audit system, and for the first time since the initial warning, the entire structure of events appeared not as fragmented suspicion, but as a continuous and irreversible timeline, displayed across multiple synchronized screens surrounding the main conference console. Jonathan Blake stood motionless at the center of it all, his focus no longer shifting between possibilities but narrowing into a single verified interpretation of the data. Daniel Reed stepped slightly to the side, allowing the final visualization layer to expand across the screen, where every interaction from the past hour had been rebuilt into a clean procedural map, each node connected with exact timestamps and authenticated system signatures. Ava Carter remained still beside Jonathan, her gaze steady and unblinking, as if she was not observing discovery, but confirmation of something she already understood from the beginning. Victoria Hale stood several feet away now, no longer attempting to move closer or farther, her posture composed but increasingly contained, as though the room itself had become a boundary she could no longer redefine. Daniel spoke carefully, his voice lower than before. "The final reconstruction confirms a full export sequence completed through a mirrored authentication pathway," he said, with validation logs matching an external transfer endpoint registered under encrypted proxy routing. The words were technical, but their meaning was absolute, because they confirmed completion rather than attempt. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the final node in the sequence where confirmation of transfer completion was clearly displayed. "So the system did not fail," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "It was used." Ava finally looked up at Jonathan directly, her voice calm and steady. "It was never about breaking the system," she said. "It was about using the system while it still looked normal." And that statement settled into the room with more weight than any technical report. Victoria's expression tightened subtly, but she did not interrupt. Instead, she listened, as if measuring how far the interpretation had already moved beyond her control. Jonathan turned slightly toward Daniel. "Trace the external endpoint," he said, and Daniel immediately responded, isolating the final destination path. The screen updated again, revealing a masked external relay channel that had been active only during a narrow window earlier in the evening. Jonathan studied it carefully, his tone now entirely procedural. "This means the data left our environment fully intact," he said, and Daniel confirmed. "Yes, sir. The integrity of the exported package was preserved during transmission." The implication was now complete, because nothing was missing, nothing corrupted, everything had been transferred exactly as designed. Victoria finally spoke again, her voice controlled but noticeably restrained. "You are interpreting a technical sequence as intentional misconduct without considering multi-user system overlap during high traffic authorization cycles," she said, but Jonathan did not look away from the screen when he responded. High traffic cycles do not generate mirrored authentication tokens, he said calmly, and that distinction eliminated the final space for ambiguity. Ava took a small step closer to the screen, pointing gently at the moment of divergence that had been identified earlier. That is when she thought no one would notice. She said softly, because everything else looked normal. Daniel nodded slightly, confirming the precision of that observation. The anomaly was designed to blend into standard system latency patterns, he added, which is why it was not flagged in real-time monitoring. Jonathan now turned fully toward Victoria, his expression no longer searching but settled. You had access, he said simply, not as accusation, but as final clarification within a verified system. Victoria paused for a brief moment, then responded carefully. Access does not equate to action, she said, but Jonathan replied without hesitation. In this case, it does, and the room fell into a deeper silence as that statement concluded the interpretive space entirely. Because the reconstructed data had already removed the need for speculation, Daniel then displayed the final system summary across the central screen, showing a completed transfer record marked with time confirmation, authentication trace, and external routing validation. Jonathan studied it for several seconds without speaking, then finally said, "This is no longer a question of interpretation." And as those words settled across the room, the entire structure of the situation stabilized into a single undeniable conclusion. Ava remained beside him, small but steady, her presence unchanged despite everything that had unfolded. And in that quiet stability, the truth no longer felt like something being discovered, but something that had already finished happening long before anyone chose to notice it. The final confirmation from the system audit did not bring noise or celebration. It brought stillness, a deeper kind of silence that settled over the Grand Roosevelt Gala like a heavy curtain dropping after the end of a performance. Every screen in the room now displayed the completed reconstruction timeline, with verified timestamps, authenticated transfer logs, and the final external routing confirmation frozen in place as undeniable structure. Jonathan Blake stood at the center of it all, no longer interpreting or questioning, only absorbing the full weight of what had already been executed through his own infrastructure. Daniel Reed stepped slightly back from the console, his hands lowering as the active command sequence ended and the system shifted into permanent audit mode. All forensic layers are now locked, he said quietly. No further modifications can be made to the reconstruction data. Ava Carter remained beside Jonathan, her small frame steady and unchanged despite the scale of what had just unfolded. Her attention still fixed on the central screen where the final export confirmation remained visible like a signature that could not be erased. Victoria Hale stood several feet away, no longer attempting subtle movement or controlled positioning, her posture now still in a way that suggested awareness rather than resistance. Jonathan finally spoke after several seconds of silence, his voice measured and precise. The system has completed its analysis, he said, and though it sounded procedural, the meaning behind it was absolute, because analysis in his world meant finality. Daniel nodded once, confirming, "Yes, sir, the audit state is fully closed with irreversible logs," and that word, irreversible, shifted the emotional weight of the room even further. Victoria exhaled slowly, then raised her gaze toward Jonathan, her expression no longer attempting to project certainty, but instead controlled restraint. "You are treating automated system pathways as intentional human direction," she said carefully. "And that distinction is critical in any legal interpretation." Jonathan looked at her now directly, his expression calm but unyielding. "The system does not act without instruction," he replied, and the simplicity of that statement removed any remaining ambiguity. Ava took a small step forward, not toward confrontation, but toward clarity, and pointed gently at the screen. Where the mirrored authentication chain was still displayed, "It did not act alone," she said softly. "Someone told it how to behave." Daniel glanced at Ava briefly, then back to Jonathan. "The mirrored token was generated using an internal authorization pattern that requires elevated clearance," he added, "which narrows access to a very limited profile group." Victoria's eyes flickered briefly at that statement, the first visible sign of disruption in her composed exterior, but she did not speak immediately. Jonathan turned slightly toward Daniel. Initiate access registry comparison, he said, and within seconds Daniel brought up a filtered list of all internal profiles that had clearance for the exact authentication pathway used in the transfer sequence. The list appeared on the secondary screen, and the room's attention collectively shifted toward it. Jonathan studied the data in silence, then spoke again. This narrows responsibility to individuals with system-level clearance, he said calmly, and though no name was spoken, the implications settled across the space like a tightening boundary. Victoria finally responded, her tone now more direct but still controlled. You are drawing conclusions from access capability rather than verified action, she said, and that is not sufficient for confirmation. Jonathan did not raise his voice. He did not need to. We are past confirmation, he said. We are at completion. Ava looked up at him briefly, then back at Victoria. Her voice still soft but precise. It already happened, she said. The system only showed what was done. Daniel then added carefully, Sir, external notification protocols have been triggered automatically due to the severity classification of the export event. And that statement changed the environment again, because it meant the situation was no longer contained within the gala or even the company system. Victoria's composure tightened further as she realized the structural implication of external escalation. Jonathan remained still for a moment, then nodded once, acknowledging the procedural consequence without emotional reaction. Maintain full system preservation, he instructed Daniel, who confirmed immediately, already locked under executive audit retention. The room now felt divided into two layers, one of observation and one of consequence, as guests who had been quietly observing from the perimeter were now fully aware that what had begun as an interruption had become a formal internal breach investigation. Victoria took a small step back again, but this time there was no attempt at escape, only recalibration. Jonathan finally addressed her directly again, his tone steady and final. You will remain present until external review confirms full procedural alignment, he said, and Victoria did not respond immediately because the structure of the situation no longer allowed for informal resolution. Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, but the effect of her initial warning now extended far beyond the moment it was spoken, because every system log, every reconstructed frame, every confirmed transfer had all traced back to the exact instant she had said not to let her leave. And in that realization, the entire room understood that nothing that followed had ever been uncertain, only hidden until the system finally chose to reveal it. The Grand Roosevelt Gala no longer felt like a celebration space. It had fully transformed into a controlled audit environment where every sound was reduced to a minimal presence, and every movement felt measured under invisible observation protocols. The screens surrounding the central conference area continued to display the finalized reconstruction timeline, now stabilized into a single verified sequence that no longer changed or updated. Jonathan Blake stood at the center of that display with a stillness that reflected full comprehension rather than confusion. Daniel Reed maintained position slightly behind the system console, confirming that all forensic modules were now permanently sealed under executive retention status. Ava Carter remained in her original position beside Jonathan, her attention steady and unchanged, as if the conclusion of the system audit only confirmed what she had already understood from the beginning. Victoria Hale stood a short distance away, no longer attempting to influence the situation through dialogue or posture, instead observing the system outputs with controlled silence, as if assessing the final boundaries of her position within the process. Jonathan finally spoke after several seconds of silence, his voice calm and precise. All system evidence has been consolidated into a single verified record, he said, and Daniel confirmed immediately, Yes, sir. The reconstruction layer is now immutable and locked for external compliance review. That statement established the final state of the system, meaning nothing further could be altered, removed, or reinterpreted within internal infrastructure. Ava stepped slightly closer to the screen again, her small voice soft but clear. So it cannot be changed anymore, she said, and Daniel responded carefully. That is correct. Once audit lock is engaged, all sequence integrity is preserved permanently. Victoria exhaled slowly, then finally spoke again, her tone now stripped of earlier confidence, but still controlled. You are treating procedural system behavior as conclusive attribution of intent, she said. But that is not how enterprise accountability frameworks operate. Jonathan turned his gaze toward her fully now, his expression steady and final. Intent is not required for verification of execution, he said, and that statement shifted the room into complete stillness. Because it removed the final distinction between interpretation and record, Daniel then expanded the final summary layer. On the screen, showing the complete timeline from initial access request through mirrored authentication, data duplication, external routing, and final export confirmation, each stage aligned precisely with system logs and timestamp validation. Jonathan studied the sequence without interruption, then spoke again. The system did not misinterpret, it recorded exactly what occurred, he said, and Ava nodded slightly without speaking. As if acknowledging alignment between observation and truth, Victoria took a small step backward, not toward escape, but toward spatial distance from the central display. Her expression now focused on the structural finality of the situation rather than attempting further explanation. Daniel then added quietly, "External compliance notification has been fully transmitted and acknowledged by secure oversight channels." And that statement introduced the final layer of consequence, because it confirmed that the matter had moved beyond internal governance. Jonathan remained still for a moment, then responded with calm authority. "Maintain full cooperation with external review protocols," he said, and Daniel confirmed immediately. "All systems are currently in red. Only compliance mode." The room now felt completely stabilized, not in tension but in completion, as though every possible variable had already resolved itself into a final state. Victoria looked toward Jonathan once more, her voice lower now. "You understand that this interpretation will extend beyond this room," she said, and Jonathan replied without hesitation. "That is the purpose of compliance verification." Ava remained beside him, quiet and unchanged, but her presence now stood at the center of everything that had unfolded, because without her initial warning, none of the sequence would have been examined in time, and the system would have remained silent where it should not have been. Daniel slowly powered down non-essential interfaces, leaving only the final audit record visible on the main display, and as the room settled into procedural closure, Jonathan looked once more at Ava, not as a child in the room, but as the point where everything had shifted into clarity, and, in that quiet recognition, the entire sequence of events reached its final stabilized state. The Grand Roosevelt Gala had fully transitioned from a social gathering into a finalized audit environment, where every system output remained fixed on the central display, and every external connection had already been sealed under compliance protocol. Jonathan Blake stood at the center of the space with complete stillness, no longer interpreting data but acknowledging its final state. Daniel Reed remained at the system console, confirming that all audit layers were locked and duplicated across secure oversight channels. Ava Carter stood quietly beside Jonathan, her small presence unchanged but now carrying the weight of having been the first and only point of interruption that changed the entire sequence of events. Victoria Hale remained at a controlled distance from the main display, her posture composed but no longer active in influence, as if she had been fully repositioned from participant to subject within the system itself. Jonathan finally broke the silence, his voice calm and absolute. "The audit record is now complete and permanently sealed," he said, and Daniel confirmed without hesitation. "Yes, sir. All data streams are now read-only under external compliance supervision." That confirmation marked the end of internal control over the sequence, meaning no further adjustments, reinterpretations, or removals could occur within the system. Ava looked up slightly toward the screen, where the final reconstruction still displayed the completed transfer chain, then spoke softly. "So everything is finished now," she said, and Daniel nodded once. "That is correct. The system has reached final closure state." Victoria exhaled slowly, then finally spoke again, her voice lower than before. "You are treating a procedural audit as definitive moral conclusion," she said carefully, but Jonathan responded immediately, his tone steady and unchanging. "We are not interpreting morality. We are verifying sequence integrity." And that distinction settled the room into complete silence once again. Daniel then began the final system shutdown of non-essential interfaces, leaving only the Verified audit record visible across the central display. Jonathan remained focused on the screen for several seconds, then turned his attention slightly toward Ava, and for the first time his expression softened into something closer to acknowledgement than authority. "You identified the anomaly before the system did," he said quietly, and Ava simply nodded without speaking, as if that fact required no further explanation. Victoria shifted slightly, now no longer attempting to engage the system or the dialogue, but instead observing the outcome as something that had already moved beyond her control or correction. Daniel spoke once more. "External Compliance Authority has confirmed receipt of all audit packages," he said. "No further internal action is required." And that statement marked the absolute conclusion of operational activity. Jonathan gave a single slow nod, then spoke for the final time in procedural tone. "Then the record stands as it is," he said, and the room remained still as the weight of finality settled over every screen, every system node, and every witness present. Ava stood quietly beside him, unchanged, but now at the center of the only thing that mattered in the entire sequence, because everything that followed had already been determined in the moment she chose to speak first. And as the gala slowly returned to controlled normalcy under external oversight protocols, the final truth of the system remained fixed, complete, and unalterable.